Thank you very much. I'll be quick. What I'm going to do is just set the tone, I think, for this discussion and describe what has been happening. It's probably true that 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I might have expected, indeed I did expect, to be spending most of my time dealing with the consequences of the budget reductions in departments. And while it's true that my office has been monitoring and keeping in touch with what's happening, it's not been quite the exercise that I expected. And I'll describe why that is. The other thing to say is that I've called this, with the punctuation not quite right, I've called this Right Statistics. And that's because some of you will have heard me talk previously about three things, which is almost the mantra for the Government Statistical Service, which is right statistics, i.e. are we doing the right thing with the money that we have? Right methods, are we producing things in the right way and constantly reviewing and refreshing our methods, our sources, our analysis, and right impact, which those of you who heard Andrew Dilnott yesterday will understand just how important that is. And actually, it's even more important at a time when budgets mean that you're doing less, then getting more or getting the maximum value from what you do is a really important part of our agenda. So briefly, how have things changed? In three headings, three ways of looking at this, in terms of budgets, in terms of outputs, what we actually do, and in terms of people. Of course, departmental budgets have got smaller, no news in that. And it's actually quite difficult to get a picture across the whole of government statistics or official statistics. And that's because often in many, many departments, there is no discrete statistics budget that you can monitor and say, this is what it was in time one, this is what it is now, and this is what it's projected to be. Often budgets are tied up with the programme budgets for departments, the policy budgets, if you like. But nevertheless, the evidence that we have is that budgets for statistics and analysis more generally has reduced across the piece exactly in line with the overall reductions in funding for government departments. Now, that's the overall picture. And of course, it varies between departments, and I can say a little bit more about that. This slide is actually the ONS budget, because ONS, of course, has a discrete budget. And this simply shows what's happened over the last few years and what the spending review settlement says for the rest of this spending review period up to 2014-15. It excludes the census. And that's because if you put the census in there, you would see a huge peak around 2011-12 and doesn't actually reflect the underlying budget. So the overall reduction for ONS is around 17% over the period. That is significant, of course, but it's actually on the low side compared with the reductions in the overall funding for many departments. I think the other thing that I would say is that that budget now is down to, well, it's projected to be, by the end of the period, down to just over £135 million. And again, as Andrew said last night or yesterday afternoon, that's quite a lot of money and quite a lot of decisions to be made about how do you spend that wisely and in the best interests of the range of users that we have, not just government. In fact, I think one of the small subtext of what's happened over the spending review was that I think for the first time, ONS, whilst its overall budget was set by the Treasury, by government, as a non-ministerial government department, of course, what it didn't do was submit a work programme to say, okay, which of these things do you want us to do and which of the things do you not want us to do? So there was no possibility of cherry picking, as it were, by ministers, the things that they wanted and they didn't want. So the control of that budget is with the Statistics Authority. The other point to make on that is that, I said it's a fair sum of money. It's actually tiny compared with the amount of money that government as a whole spends. And of course, what this doesn't show is the increasing importance and need for statistical information to underpin the choices that government is making, that Parliament is debating, and that the public might expect. So one of the things that has changed enormously since the statistical legislation in 2007 is the requirement to take account not just of the needs of government, but the needs of all users. That's a real challenge to us. And again, I'll say a little bit more about that. Outputs. There has been a reduction in the number of outputs. In fact, you'd have thought that as a GSS we'd be able to count these things, but actually we can't really. What is an output? One of the things that some of this is simply stopping what departments used to do and used to publish. Some of it is consolidating releases, doing things in a different way. Some of it is because some departments, particularly ONS, used to count things like methodological reports as outputs, rather than just statistical series as outputs. So there's all kinds of issues there, but nevertheless, there has been a reduction in the number of statistical outputs from across the GSS. So reducing budgets, reducing outputs, but actually there are now more professional statisticians in the civil service than ever before. And I think that might be a bit of a surprise, particularly to those, I was talking to Ian McLean just now, to those who remember the 1980s, where there was also, of course, big public sector expenditure cuts. And one of the things that happened there was that there was a real reduction in the number of people working in official statistics, number of statisticians. There was a recruitment ban that went on for quite a long time. And one of the things that 2 years ago, I'm old enough to have remembered that. And one of the things that I was determined on was that actually trying to preserve some of the capability was at the heart of this. So I'll say a little bit more about that. But just to say as well, looking forward, these are the numbers in the final column to 2011. The expected is still going up. The expected number by March next year will go up by another 50. That is dependent on us being able to recruit. And one of the interesting phenomena is that lots of departments are reporting difficulty in being able to recruit into the civil service the professional statisticians that there are vacancies for. That's the professional cadre, if you like. We estimate the total Government Statistical Service to be about 7,000. So these are all the people involved in the production of statistics, analysis and statistical advice across government. And that pattern for the GSS is similar to the pattern for other analytical professions. So if you can't read that, the statisticians at the top line, the blue line, economists, social researchers and operational researchers. And from this is being monitored across government as a whole. From this, you can see the pattern is very similar. Growth in the number of economists, growth in the number of operational researchers. Social researchers not the same. That their numbers have been flat over the period. Again, just to put this in context, I said that the GSS as a whole is about 7,000 people. Back to the 1980s. Between 1980 and 1984, the GSS reduced in size from about 9,000 to 6,500 in just that 4-year period. And it further reduced during the 1980s to about 4,000 in 1990. And since then, it's been growing. So down to 4,000 in 1990, up to about 7,000 now. I showed on the previous slide the Government Statistician Group, the professional cadre, grown from about 800 in the year 2000 to where it is now. What it doesn't show is that one of the things within those statistics has been a reduction in absolute and certainly proportional size in the number of senior civil servants. And in the civil service, grade matters. And one of the things that I've been concerned about is that now across the whole of the GSS, there are something like only 40-something senior civil servants who are statisticians, and of course a lot of those are in ONS. And one of the concerns that I have is this word impact I used at the beginning, is how do we make sure that statistical thinking is heard right at the top of government departments? How do we make sure that statisticians and other analysts are recognised for the contribution that they can make? And there's various bits of work going on. Very quickly, what have departments done in the face of the budget cuts? They've stopped doing things. They've reduced things, sample sizes, frequency of outputs, or they've redesigned. That bottom line is not meant to be facetious. In that the big question, I think, for all of us that you may want to come back to is, how do you decide what the right level of funding is? How do you decide what the right outputs are? And how do you decide what the right design is? And that's, I think, one of the questions that, that this whole period has raised. Won't go through this, but at the heart of it is trying to understand what are those statistics that the UK, not the government, but that the UK as a whole needs. And we might come back to that. These are the kinds of questions that we need to ask and that we have been asking during this period of cuts, which, I read the papers too. This isn't the end of it. So, I have to finish. My final slide is civil service reform. That those of you who are interested in these things will see in the civil service reform plan quite a lot of references to the professions. That's come about because of work that various professions across the civil service have done on this very point about needing to make sure that voices are heard properly within departments and that they're heard at the top of departments. So over the next few months, building capability will be the core of our activities. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about how these issues look from where I sit as the head of the monitoring and assessment functions of the UK Statistics Authority. I'm not going to talk about individual cuts and cases, but I'll be very interested in any that are causing you concern and you'd like to tell us about. I'd like to think about a framework for both considering the impact of cuts and maximising the benefit of what remains after cuts. Now, if budgets are the inputs to the statistical system, then the outputs are not statistics, but value. We put in money and we get out some public good. But that's not an automatic process. The value created by using statistics, the value is created by using statistics to make the world a better place. We can see statistics as the stuff that drive the engine of decision-making, the fuel in that engine. And the value derived from the fuel depends on what the user does with the engine as much as on the quality of the fuel. I have to say this is not a very good analogy, but I'm going to use it, and I'll come back to it in a minute. We think there are something like 200 bodies in the UK, official bodies, that produce at least some official statistics. And we infer that those bodies have statistical budgets, although, as Jill indicated, they may not be specific to statistics and they may not include everything that you would expect, all the data collection and processing costs. It is probably true that at least some of those budgets have been reduced and will be reduced. It's less clear that those cuts will affect statistical outputs in proportion. Time will tell, and we hope for the best. But my worry is that the bits that we should most want to defend are actually where the cuts may fall. We must defend capacity for analysis and presentation and communication of data, even if that means collecting less data in the first place. My fear is that the inertia in the system and the instincts of statisticians actually favor data collection. And so cuts may end up falling further down the value chain on the presentation and communication and getting good out of statistics. If so, the value of the statistical product itself will be reduced and the case for data collection potentially undermined. In effect, if we stop helping people to use the service, the case for having it is reduced. So on balance, I would support a shift in the use of statistical resources away, in a small way, from data collection towards analysis, presentation, communication. It's only a guess, but if 95% of the resource is currently being devoted to data collection and management and processing, if that's reduced to 92%, you get quite a big increase in what's left for analysis and communication. But such a shift would not be simple to achieve. Statistical budgets in Whitehall are set almost entirely independently of each other. They're at the discretion of ministers, permanent secretaries, finance directors, rather than statisticians, although, of course, statisticians can and must continue to argue their corner. Such a funding model inevitably restricts central statistical planning, coordination, and priority setting. Government departments are not required to consult or even tell the UK Statistics Authority about big changes they're planning. However, this dispersed budget setting does have some virtues. In particular, decisions to fund statistics are traded off against other kinds of work. So benefit statistics are funded against the cost of benefit offices rather than against other kinds of statistics, and that can actually work to the advantage of statistics. I'm old enough to remember the introduction in the early 1980s of the British Crime Survey. If crime statistics had been produced by the then Central Statistical Office, I don't think it would have happened. The Home Office statisticians were not at all keen on the introduction of the BCS. It was the Home Office policy interest in finding an alternative to police-recorded crime data and their control of huge budgets which drove it through. So I'm not too negative about dispersed budgets. I don't see why more statistics on, say, public health should lead to less on the environment. Trading off health statistics against other health expenditure seems to me at least as rational. But this does necessitate clear and coherent defense of the value of the statistics. If you're going to argue for health statistics, expenditure on health statistics rather than expenditure on nurses, you've got to get a good argument. Back on the question of cuts, we need to start from where we are now. Some future cuts may feed through as reduced value. Jill alluded to smaller sample sizes, but some will not. Not everything needs to be defended equally. And if we are going to defend production, we must demonstrate the value being delivered. We must argue persuasively that the value of the statistics exceeds the value of alternative uses of the same amount of resource. I'm not sure the environment feels quite that brutal yet, but I am sure we're heading there. And I would say we must remember that only politically persuasive argument will do. When cuts have been made, clearly the impact must be investigated, and it must be investigated before deciding on whether we're going to challenge those cuts. If cutting data collection allows statisticians to defend analysis, presentation, and communication, maybe we can support it. We risk losing credibility if we challenge everything. The Statistics Authority has a formal mechanism for assessing cuts through what we call statistical expenditure reports. We've done 7 of those, I think, so far, and we fully intend to continue with them. To understand the value of the Statistical Service, what it does, and assess the real impact of cuts, clearly we need to identify the use that's made of the statistics and the public good associated with that use, and the scope to enhance the benefits, the good, with or without additional expenditure. Only then will we really know what we're losing. This does sound difficult when you put it in those abstract terms, but we must remember it's a political, with a small p, and a big P, political argument, not a scientific or statistical argument. We must find and explain the killer uses, the ones that government cannot take chances with. If talking about statistics on the services sector, as the Today programme was this morning, we need to point to their use in guiding macroeconomic policy, in shaping tax policy, promoting the UK's international competitiveness, monitoring the recovery of the financial sector. We need to find the people who really understand those uses and get the description right. Investigating use and potential use and the benefits that flow are, of course, also the steps to maximising the value of what remains after budget cuts. Maximising efficiency, or the efficacy of the fuel within the engine of decision-making, needs to become a kind of conscious focus of government statistical work. The emphasis really does need to be on the way we're making the world a better place, not just collecting more fuel. Government statisticians need to have faith, proclaim success, and convince those who control the budgets. That agenda has never been more urgent. Now, these points that I've been trying to make are rather abstract, and I did try to find a way to illustrate them with some PowerPoint slides. I think I failed, but let me introduce you anyway to the engine of decision-making. So you put in facts and statistics, opinions, and along it goes, pulling decisions behind it. You'll see it emits some rather noxious stuff which isn't of much use to decision making. That's not official statistics, and it would probably be tactful for me not to suggest which government outputs it does equate to. It's not moving very fast. There it goes. There's the statistics fueling the engine. Now, if not used to full effect, it only pulls a few decisions along, but it can pull lots. The quality of the fuel is important, but so too is what you do with the engine. Looking at it in terms of the value chain, I'll skip that one, the value chain that runs from planning through production and publication, this should join up, as indeed a little train set does. Publication must drive use, but use needs to drive our future planning. And we can only do that if we understand well the use of official statistics. Getting this to work is the way both to defend against unwarranted cuts and ensure we get the maximum good from the service. Thank you very much.
So I think the session is titled something like "Have the Cuts Undermined the UK Evidence Base?" And I think Jill has said in summary that budgets have gone down, outputs have gone down, but her band of statisticians have held up much better than expected. And I think Richard has given a work programme for many years ahead. I should just say, what is this thing, radical statistics? It's not the latest flight of Bayesian fancy, as David Finney wondered quite recently. It's totally oblivious of 4 decades of existence of this organisation, which generally has campaigned for public use of statistics for progressive change, as we used to call it, and has been a home for a lot of people who thought that they could use their statistics in extracurricular activities over the decades through publications, conference, and so on. You can see more from there. And what I think prompted our invitation here is that we have had a blog since last year to put up news of reductions in official statistics worldwide. And so myself and Alison McFarlane, Alex Fenton and Tom Clark have tried to plough the fairly nebulous information about what constitutes the evidence base a bit more widely than statistics, narrowly, and a bit more widely than just government statistics. One has to be aware of the context of a government that for 2 years has made it very clear it aims to reduce the operations of the state. It aims to transfer through privatisation, through devolvement of planning responsibilities, and it says it has to do that in order to reduce the public debt. And in those circumstances, it would hardly be possible for statistics to remain unscathed. I had a few introductory slides, and some of the things I was going to say are very similar to what has already been said, so maybe I can get through things quicker. I just wanted to give a bit of a wider perspective in that official statistics were brought up on the needs of government originally for population and trade statistics through army and taxation needs. It was the World War II that actually stimulated the creation of the Central Statistical Office only in 1941. The expansion of the GSS, Government Statistical Service, under the leadership of Klaus Moser, can now be seen almost as an aberration, if a very welcome one, from what went before and the Rayner Review that Jill mentioned in the early 1980s, and the severe contraction of research and statistics at that time, severe in comparison with what's happened so far. And as Jill has already mentioned, and I would stress, it is very early to find horror stories. I'm not going to give you big horror stories, although any one of you might stand up and mention some. It's more, can we spot the implications of what's happening at the moment? In the backdrop of a very clear expansion in statistics driven both by performance management policies from government over the in the 2000s in particular, and through the expansion technologically of the ability for administration statistic data to be captured as statistics and considered in a different way. At that time, through the rise of legislation on statistics in Britain and the kite mark for national statistics. Purposes of official statistics, it's worth reminding ourselves that there are sort of broader, from narrow to broader senses of this government's needs only, wider supporting of others' needs, and then the need for anybody to be able to hold the government to account. And it's important to make those distinctions, and I will make them as we go towards the end of this short presentation. But actually, all those purposes use the same statistics very often, and so the differences between them are not so great. And when it comes to it, the thing that would really be biting criticism of government is not that they're hiding from us the things that we need to know to bring them to account, but that they themselves don't know what they're doing. And those are the things that will trip them up. These are the things I was going to go through. The first three, exactly the same things that Jill was going to go through. You'll see some of the same statistics. I'll be able to talk to them very briefly, I think, which will be good. Keep me going quickly. On expenditure, of course, it was a comprehensive spending review. The Chief Scientific Advisor reported on this late last year. Basically, he said, we've done a hell of a lot of work on this, but actually, it's really hard to tell what's going on. I questioned the allocation of resources, not to research and development, but his allocation of his resources to find out what was going on, because it was so difficult. One clear thing was a reduction in some departments on commissioned research, which was singled out as the budgets likely to be most cut, but an increase in others. So variation between departments, research council, academic spending was held level in absolute terms, which means a reduction in real terms, and is also academic research affected by the lack of government budgets to commission research, including from academic departments. So that's sort of bit of wider context than simply the statisticians. I want to mention local government, because it's there that a lot of the cuts in the evidence base are taking place much more severely than in central government, and particularly in the development and planning functions that traditionally have motored and held and nurtured some of the standard research and statistics series at a local level. And so both the Institute for Fiscal Studies and others, Joseph Roundtree's Foundation study, that's the Hastings citation there, found that local authorities are finding a reduction in back office staff particularly, but again that it's early to say. There have been 2 rounds of reorganisation. There will be more to come. Local Authorities Research and Intelligence Association has just completed a survey in which it's found that half of its respondents, over 300 respondents, have said they've experienced drops in research budget sequentially in the last 2 years, and that a quarter of those drops were severe rather than moderate, and their greatest challenge was to achieve more with less. Highly surprised, what I think it is evidence that this is something not, again, variable in its impact, but major in how it's felt at the cold face of research. On to staffing, we asked Jill for what we thought was a fairly simple set of statistics, a table of types of profession and across recent years by grade and department. And so let's do that, I'm sure she'll know. And rather than ask a parliamentary question and get all sorts of people scrabbling around, we'll just do it formally like that. Jill actually hasn't been able to do that for reasons I think that are probably this information is harder than you'd think to come across, and yet surely it is, if nobody else knows, but the UK Statistics Authority, who should know. This graph, the green one, is exactly the same figures as Jill showed, although Jill, you called it the the Government Statistical Service, but it's published as the Government Statistical Group, which is all those involved in the production of national statistics? Official statistics. And indeed, which has been going up. The figures that we got, not produced by ONS, but via ONS, so that economists and social researchers dipping actually rather differently from the figures. But generally, in the backdrop of the growth over the 2000s, maybe a halting, but not the severe drop that was found in the 80s yet. The Government Statistical Group, actually, as I understand it, can change according to the change in what is considered as official statistics, and more people drawn in that way without there being more people involved working on the ground face. And that, if that's not the case, that's great, but that's what people in departments have suggested might be the case and needs some explanation, I think. Okay. Again, it's worth just comparing central government and local government. The increase around 2008-9 is entirely about public corporations, which I think is the bank nationalisations at that time. So the key thing really is the dip in the last few years, more so for local government and central government in staffing generally. And in local government, again, it will be the health and education that is more protected, and the back office staff, including many of the research staff, that will suffer that most. Let me continue to activity and mention 3 surveys that haven't been mentioned, which are perhaps major visible cuts. I'll come back to them at the end. I don't want to go sort of slowly in order to miss out some summary towards the end. In terms of statistical series, harder to cut maybe than to simply stop surveys in some cases. But all regional reporting by the communities and local government have been stopped because the regions have been abolished. And many of those responsibilities for statistical series are now back on district councils, not the county councils where all the experience is, but district councils where the experience isn't. The UK Statistics Authority has an official statistics committee to which the National Statistician, Jill, reports each quarter now on cessations. They consider them. As far as I know, they haven't made any recommendations, and it is hard for them because they recognise too that actually cessations may mean merging, they're not quite sure. What about additions? What's the whole picture really mean? Here's a figure, Jill, of the number of national statistics over 4 periods. Jill showed the totals there at the bottom, the last 3 figures showing a rise to 2011 and then a drop to 2012, so a drop in output. Some of the categories, I think, change year to year for the same statistic. Some of the very small categories are clearly just category idiosyncrasies, so compendia and reference are usually actually included in other categories. Don't worry about that too much. At the end is a list of those numbers deleted in each theme, but deleted also means merge. It's not necessarily lost completely, and others are added. So one would expect the drop from 2011 to 2012 to be not as great as the number of deletions, and that you can see that the number of deletions at 272 is more than actually the drop, only 200. I don't know why. It'd be interesting to know why. Economy and government drops from 2011 to 2012 are both considerably greater than the deletions. What's going on there? I don't know, but it's the kind of thing I would expect to be pounced on and have some answer to by those who might well know. These are categorised too by frequency, and there's a category of ad hoc analysis which has dropped from 157 to 120, or what's there at the bottom, to 46 over the last 2 years. That says to me that ad hoc analyses are being reduced more than the standard series. That analysis and there seems to be supported by other bits of evidence here and there. It's a thing that's suffered. In a way, when one holds on to capacity, as Jill said, one's trying to hold on to the staff skills and to the basic series, and the thing again that goes is that the analysis, in order to allow people to publicly know regularly just what is going in the interpretation of the regular statistics. Quality, there's some quality reductions are very clear about reductions in sample size, but mostly it's a result of reduced numbers of staff. I'm going to go on quickly, and the morale, civil service survey of morale, I suspect is very cuttable, because it is showing pretty poor morale in those departments that have been cut most, particularly the CLG. Reorganisations, and again this is in health service and local authorities, have an impact on morale by getting rid of the most skilled people through early redundancies and leaving those with more things to do with less solid skills, and that's clearly the case from reports in local government. Effectiveness, hard to do. I shan't talk about that unless anybody wants to. Let me just go to 2 last slides. Some features of what's going on. Some things are getting pruned, those things that are easy to prune. I've mentioned surveys which are also political hits in the sense that the Tell Us survey, the citizenship survey, attached to previous administration's priorities. Analysis, I think, is being hit, as I've said, more than others. There's something to do with the coalition philosophy of localism, of reducing targets, that also suggests that particular statistical series will not be prioritised. And in the sense that the aim of a market of services, it's not only that there will be diversity of providers, and so the statistics of what's happening in general are incomplete, but also that the interest is not in the need of the population, but only in the demand as expressed through market mechanisms or simply through other political demand too. Clearly there is variation in impact that I've mentioned. I had to put this in. William Farr, originator of population and health analyses, and our official statistics, ONS business plan now says that health analysis is not a priority. It has to make priorities, and I think we need to really be clear what is happening. What to expect in the medium term, this is my last slide. Very concerned about open data. Fabulous, lots of data, but without interpretation, without validation, all it leads to is a lack of trust in the figures, because anyone can make the interpretation they wish without the clear validation required to improve those open data. And that puts official statistics in a vulnerable reputational position. The diversity of state provision I've mentioned, but the question that's raised then is, well, who's going to set the standards to encourage completeness across the nation for responsibilities that are now diverse and local? And there is a cumulative impact on democratic accountability, I think, with examples that one can look at, things that are happening with fewer statistics to look at. You're supposed to laugh at that last one, really. But the UK Statistics Authority are in a difficult position. Can't complain at everything, said Richard. But they must be up there being the standard bearers for the best statistics that there are, and have some successes in doing that. Otherwise, what are they there for? I would be very interested in any of your in the discussion or afterwards by emailing either myself, I can be Googled easily, Ludi, Simpson, or to reduced statistics, one word, at radstats.org.uk, and let's see if we can make the best of a bad world at the moment for official statistics. Thank you.